The flatbed groaned under 6 tons of black rubber, and every man standing in Wade Kessler's driveway that morning was doing his best not to laugh in his face. A couple of them didn't try very hard. Roy Ostrander leaned against his own truck, arms crossed, watching Wade and his nephew wrestle another coil of conveyor belting down off the trailer. "You paid money for that?" "Didn't pay a dime," Wade said, not looking up. "They were paying somebody to haul it away. Figured it might as well be me." "That's because it's garbage, Wade." Wade didn't argue the point. He kept working the come-along, easing the roll down onto the gravel, sweat cutting a clean line through the dust on his neck. Behind him sat 40-some more coils just like it, cracked in places, caked with limestone dust, stacked in crooked rows across the yard, like some kind of rubber graveyard nobody had asked for. Even the dog kept its distance. 8 months from that morning, Roy Ostrander would be the one calling Wade's shop to ask if there was any belt left. He wouldn't be the only one. But standing in that driveway with rubber dust on his boots, Wade didn't know any of that yet. He didn't have a use for the belts. He didn't have a plan. He had a feeling he couldn't quite explain. And on a cattle operation that had lost money 3 years running, a feeling was sometimes all a man could afford to act on. It started 3 weeks earlier at Bridger Quarry, 20 miles south of Millrose, where Wade had gone to price a used stock tank. The quarry was modernizing its whole conveyor system, swapping worn belting for a computer-monitored line that didn't need a man walking it every hour. The old sections were coming out in pieces, and the plant foreman, Kurt Yoder, stood over a pile of them looking like a man with a problem nobody wanted to solve. "Landfill won't take it without a disposal fee," Kurt said. "Recycler's 200 miles off, and what they'd charge to haul it is more than we'd get back in scrap. Company just wants it gone." Wade looked at the pile a long moment. 2 inches of solid rubber, steel cable running through the belly of it, cut into sections 8 to 30 feet long, still holding the smell of crushed rock. Ugly. Heavy. Worthless to a quarry that had no more use for it. But Wade had spent 31 years patching gates and sheds with whatever was lying around, and he knew heavy rubber didn't rot or rust. He didn't have a plan yet. He had a hunch, and hunches were cheaper than most things on a ranch that couldn't afford new equipment that year. "I'll take it off your hands," he said. Kurt didn't ask him twice. Getting all 50 sections home took 4 trips with a borrowed trailer, and by the last load, half the county had an opinion about it. His wife, Linda, had the most measured one. She watched the yard fill up from the kitchen window and finally asked over supper if he had a plan for any of it. "Not yet," Wade said. "You've got until spring," she told him. "If it's just sitting there taking up ground, it goes to auction." Wade figured that was fair enough. He didn't have an argument ready, only a feeling that the rubber was worth more than what it looked like. The first real use came about a week later, and it came by accident, and the way most useful things do. Gene Halsey ran cattle on the place bordering Wade's to the east, and he'd spent the fall fighting a chute rail that had worn through its wood sheeting, catching cattle across the hip on their way up the loading ramp. He'd lost hide, patience, and nearly a finger trying to patch it with plywood that split inside a week. Wade was at Gene's trading a battery charger when he saw the fresh gouge on a heifer's side. He didn't say much. He went home, clamped an 8-foot section of belt to his cutting table, and worked a blade rated for tire tread through the rubber and steel cable, slow and even. He came back the next morning with the strip rolled under his arm. "Let me bolt this over that rail," he said. "Costs you nothing to find out." Gene had nothing to lose and 40 head to run through that afternoon. The rubber held. Cattle hit it going up the ramp the way they always did, and instead of a gouge and a ball of pain, there was a dull thud and nothing else. Gene came looking for Wade at dark, still in his coveralls. "That thing hasn't torn at all," he said, like he didn't quite believe it. "Didn't figure it would. How'd you know that'd work?" Wade thought about it. Didn't know. Figured it was worth trying before it was worth throwing away. If you've ever looked at somebody else's pile of junk and wondered what you could do with it, you're exactly who this channel is for. Old Farmer Jack's stories is built on people like Wade, ordinary folks who found value where everyone else saw waste. Hit subscribe if that's your kind of story, because Wade was only getting started. Word doesn't travel fast in a county like Milrose. It travels immediately. Dr. Wren Talley, the large animal vet who covered half the county, was out at Jean's the following week for an unrelated call and ran her hand along the rubber-lined rail while walking a heifer through the chute. "Where'd this come from?" "Wade Kessler," Jean said. "You know him?" "Everybody knows Wade. Didn't know he was in the rubber business." "He's not," Jean said. "Not yet, anyway." She didn't say much else that day, but 3 days later, on a call 40 miles west, she mentioned it to a rancher who'd been fighting his own chute problems for 2 calving seasons running. That was the first time Wade's name traveled somewhere he hadn't carried it himself. The second use came off Wade's own ground. Every winter, the feeding area behind his barn turned into a bog. 3 months of hooves and thawing snow, working good dirt into 6 inches of suction that swallowed boots and wore cattle down standing in the cold wet of it. Gravel disappeared into the mud in a season. In December, with nothing better to do on a Sunday, Wade dragged 4 belt sections out to the feeding ground, laid them flat with the edges overlapped, and staked the corners down with rebar. The rubber sat proud of the mud instead of sinking into it. By February, while the rest of the county's feed grounds were frozen ruts and standing water, Wade's cattle stood dry, clean to the hoof, chewing hay like the winter wasn't happening to them. A neighbor driving the county road slowed down enough to notice once, then slowed down again a few days later to stop and ask about it. That neighbor was Dale Whitcomb, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What'll you take for 4 of those?" Wade hadn't thought about selling any of it. He ran the math on what it had actually cost him. His time, a little diesel, nothing else. And named a number that felt almost embarrassing to ask for. $40 a section. You haul it yourself. Dale wrote a check for $160 right there in the yard. It wasn't much money, but it was the first time anyone had paid Wade Kessler for something he hadn't grown, raised, or fixed for somebody else, and that mattered more than the number written on the check. After that, it didn't happen all at once, but it didn't stop either. Dale mentioned it to his brother-in-law, who ran a small dairy outside town and needed something better than plywood for his calving pens. Dr. Talley mentioned it on her rounds. The feed store started fielding questions about that rubber matting Kessler's got. By March, Wade had moved half the original 50 belts, cut down into chute liners, gate wraps, calving pen flooring, and feeding area mats. And Bridger Quarry had already called twice asking if he wanted the next batch coming out of their second conversion phase. He said yes both times. One of those orders came from a horse rancher 3 townships over who wanted belt sections wired up between fence posts as a windbreak for a calving shed exposed to the north wind. Wade cut and delivered it himself, curious whether it would hold against open plains, wind the way it had held up against cattle and mud. It did. The rancher called back before calving season even started, wanting enough to wrap 2 more sides of the shed. By early summer, Wade was spending more hours cutting rubber than tending cattle, which Linda pointed out more than once. He brought his nephew Colton on part-time to help haul and cut. Some weeks, a truck pulled into the yard every day or two, a rancher he'd never met, cash folded in a shirt pocket, because nobody in Milrose County trusted a check for less than $100. It was still small, but it had a shape to it now. Would you have hauled 50 conveyor belts home, not knowing what you'd do with them? Let us know in the comments. Wade still isn't sure he would have, if you'd asked him that first morning in the driveway. By August, the easy part was over. Bridger. Quarry finished its conversion and had nothing left to give away. Wade called 2 other quarries and got the same answer each time. Nobody was handing belt over free anymore. Word had gotten around that old conveyor belt had a use now, and word had a way of putting a price on things that used to be nobody's problem, but a landfill's. At the same time, a feedlot outside Garrison City called wanting 18 pen floors lined, more square footage than Wade had moved in the previous 8 months combined, with a hard deadline tied to their fall cattle intake. It was the kind of order that could set the business up for real. Wade told them yes before he'd stopped to think it through. And by the time he had, he'd already committed the shop's next 2 months to a job he didn't have material to fill. He drove to Denver to price new industrial belting and about choked on the number. Buying it retail wasn't a rounding error. It was real money he didn't have. Money that would eat most of whatever profit was left in the feedlot contract. He sat in the truck in that supplier's parking lot a long while before he drove home. Linda didn't say much when he told her, which was worse than if she had. She finally asked whether he'd taken on more than a 2-man operation with a cutting table in a machine Chet could actually deliver. It was a fair question, and Wade didn't have a fair answer for it. He thought seriously about calling the feedlot back and telling them to find somebody else, a thought that cost him some sleep before he talked himself out of it by morning. For a couple of weeks, it looked like the thing he'd built might be too small to grow and too big to stay the same size, with a customer's deadline closing in either way. The break came from Kurt Yoder, oddly enough, the same foreman who'd handed off that first pile back in the fall. Kurt had since moved into a regional role overseeing several plants for the same company, and when Wade called him half out of options, Kurt didn't have material to give away. But he had something almost as useful. A list. Gravel pits, a limestone quarry in the next county, a grain terminal 2 hours north. All of them replaced conveyor belting on a schedule. All of them still paid to get rid of it. And none of them had ever thought to call a rancher first. "Can't give it to you free anymore," Kurt said, "but I can make some calls. Tell them you'll haul it cheap instead of them paying disposal. Still a good deal for everybody." Wade came home that night and laid it out for Linda at the kitchen table, the way he probably should have laid out the first 50 belts 8 months earlier. The sites Kurt had lined up, the loan he'd need for a real flatbed, the feedlot order still sitting there half-filled. She listened without interrupting the way she had back in December, and when he finished, she asked the same question she'd asked him then. "You have a plan for it this time?" "Getting closer to one." She thought about it a long moment, then nodded once. "Then go sign for the truck." Over the next month, Wade set up standing arrangements with 4 sites within 150 miles, each glad to have a standing call instead of a scramble every time their line needed work. He financed the flatbed, took out a basic liability policy on Colton's advice, and gave the operation a real name, Kessler Ranch Rubber, mostly because Linda got tired of writing "that belt thing" on the tax paperwork. The feedlot order got filled 6 weeks late, but it got filled, and once it was, 2 more feedlots in the region started calling before Wade called them. Wade still thought of himself as a rancher who'd gotten lucky noticing something, not a businessman. But the business didn't much care what he called himself. If you're enjoying watching that turn into something real, stay with us, because the number this story ends on is one nobody, including Wade, saw coming that first morning in the driveway. 3 years after that first flatbed pulled into his driveway, Wade sat down with Linda and an accountant in town to go over what the business had actually done, because neither of them had tracked it closely enough to say for certain. Wade figured they'd done well for themselves, enough to feel proud of. Nothing that would surprise anybody. The accountant worked through it category by category. Individual ranchers buying chute liners, gate wraps, and calving pen. Flooring a few sections at a time. Feedlot pen lining contracts, 11 of them now across 3 counties. Standing orders from 2 horse ranches for windbreak systems and trailer ramp padding. A dairy operation that had become a steady repeat customer. A ranch supply contractor who now bought in bulk to resell to smaller operations that couldn't order direct. Wade watched the total climb line by line and didn't say anything. When the accountant turned the page around, the number read just over $1.2 million in cumulative gross sales since Kessler Ranch Rubber started keeping real books. Every dollar of it traced back to a cattle operation, a feedlot, a calving shed, or a ranch that needed something the old material could solve. Linda looked at the number, then looked at Wade. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Wade finally set his coffee down like it had gotten heavier in his hand. "That's business money," he said, mostly to himself. "Not sitting in the bank money." "I know," Linda said. "It's still a lot of business. It wasn't the kind of number that changed what truck Wade drove. He still drove the same one, mostly, with the newer flatbed added on for hauling. But it had paid off the loan, kept Colton on full-time with benefits Wade never had at his age, and put the cattle operation itself on steadier ground than it had stood on in a decade. Because for the first time in years, a bad cattle market didn't automatically mean a bad year. Roy Ostrander called the shop eventually, same as the others. Not for anything big, just 2 sections to patch a gate catching his gelding's hip. Wade sold it to him at the regular price and didn't say a word about that morning in the driveway. Roy didn't bring it up either. Some things didn't need saying twice. Every so often, Wade still drives past Bridger Quarry, past the new conveyor line running clean and quiet through the crusher house. Sometimes there's a fresh pile stacked near the fence, cut cable, scrap steel, something the plant doesn't need anymore. He doesn't stop every time. But he looks the same way he looked that first morning 3 weeks before. He became the man half the county was laughing at. Kessler Ranch Rubber has a website now built by Colton and a small metal sign bolted to the machine shed that Linda ordered without telling him. Wade still isn't sure he needed the sign. He didn't take it down. He'd learned by then that value doesn't always sit where a price tag says it does. Sometimes it's sitting in a pile nobody's bothered to look at twice, waiting on somebody stubborn enough, or broke enough, or just curious enough to ask what it's still good for. That's the story of 50 conveyor belts and the ranch they ended up steadying. If you liked riding along with Wade on this one, subscribe to Old Farmer Jack's stories. There's always another pile of somebody's junk out there, waiting on the right person to walk by and wonder,